Welcome everyone back to the Ops Show, where we bring you the trials and tribulations, automations and collaborations from the world of DevOps and the greater developer experience. It's going to be a great show, maybe one of the best shows today yet. And because we have Mason Blake, a dear friend and also co-founder of Up Council, recently was acquired and joined LinkedIn. And it's really great to have you. Also, it's really great to have backgrounds for the first time. Things are moving very quickly here in the COVID scenarios. So Mason, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and you have a really interesting startup story that I've met you on at least a few times.
Yeah, Sam, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate you guys bringing me onto the show. I guess a little background on myself. So, as you said, I was the co-founder and CTO of Up Council. I've been working in startups for 20 years or so, and we started Up Council, Matt and I, my co-founder, like 8 years ago or so. Over that time, we raised about $25+ million in capital and grew the company, throughout that time. So Up Council was and is a marketplace for legal services focused on business law primarily only. So when a company wants to hire a lawyer, they come to Up Council, get a bunch of proposals, and hire lawyers and work with them through our platform. So we have and did learn quite a lot, and I'm sure Kyle has a lot of great stories that we could swap, as well as you, Tristan, about just the entrepreneurial journey and learning how to go from being a coder to being an entrepreneur and running a startup and growing a company, which is really fun journey for sure. So yeah, during that time we landed in a good spot where now we're at LinkedIn and we're working on a similar type of product experience there. So I can talk about that a little bit too.
Yeah. I think the first time we met was at Angel Pad in San Francisco. I had just moved out there. We realized we're both Midwest kids.
Yeah,
so in
Midwest.
that sense, kind of Canadian, like Kyle. South Dakota, Minnesota. It's been we've had a lot of artists on the show as well, which artists turn coders. How is I know you've done a lot of music and guitar and how was that switch into coding in the first place?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I was always into computers and I was always into programming. I remember very, very vividly when we got our first computer. It was an 8086 with the 5.25 floppy and a giant red switch on the back to turn it on. And I fell in love from the very first time and started writing, code in basic, GW basic at the time, and learning how to, build little cool scripts and stuff at home. So both music and my love of computers started when I was really, really young. And by the time I was ready to, and I needed to make a decision about how I was going to spend my life, I kind of just had a sense that I was going to be broke for the rest of my life if I chose to become a musician. And I think I chose right. So I know I always wanted to focus on music and keep that a big part of my life, but working on computers was a good career, and music is still a good hobby for me too. So kind of keep that happening in the background still.
I have a very similar story actually. Drummer
Oh,
from
really?
a young age. The entrepreneurial side of me took hold when I was young. I had kind of like through concerts and tried to create record labels, and that's what taught me to that's why I started programming. I was like, I got to create this thing to do this. And then I kind of concluded, I'm like, yeah, money ruined art, and I love music, but there's a different pathway to still use that mathematical and logical and creative formula that you get in music and apply it to code. I see this so much, people who come from that
Absolutely.
music background, because music is very similar to programming in a lot of ways, I find.
Totally agree. Yeah, I was actually a drummer first too. So,
oh, really? Great.
we have I was a drummer since 3rd grade, and I picked up the guitar in high school, and now I play a number of different instruments. But yeah, I agree. I think musicians a lot of times they excel in computers, and vice versa, or math as well, right? So math was something that I enjoyed and was good with when I was younger. And I think that there's a very interesting link with music, because it's very pattern oriented. It's very rhythmic and like there's just an inherent connection there, and not to mention sort of the just like the right side of the brain and the using the same areas of the brain as well. So super interesting stuff. I've always been fascinated by neuroscience and how music and neuroscience and all of that kind of come together as well. So
that's great. I'm just gonna turn off my fan real quick, guys. It's getting cold in here.
Oh, sure. I think Kyle always thinks that we can hear him, but I feel like I can never hear the stuff that happens in the background. Like there's a garbage truck.
Yeah, it's this
we did
mic,
a webinar
man.
this morning, and Kyle's kid came in and was like saying hello. But let me just say, you handled that way better, Kyle, than that guy on CNN.
I know.
Just gonna stiff arm his kid.
That's what was going through my head when it was happening. I was like, don't push him away, whatever you do. No, the best part about that was I have a slide that has a dinosaur on it, and so he comes in, he sees the dinosaur, he loves dinosaurs, right? But yeah, sign of the times. I feel like this happens to everybody right now, with everybody work from home. Anyone who has kids, at least, I should say.
Yeah. No, I actually like that. I like that because I think it's humanized the people that you work with a lot more, right? Like we would show up in the office, we would be in these sterile, meeting rooms, and maybe you could say, how's your family doing or whatever, but you never really knew, you never saw those kids, you never really, especially in a bigger company. And now it's great. Like, kid pops into the video channel, everybody loves it, right? it's fun. So
yeah, that's what I felt like.
Yeah,
I was like, wow, this actually, I really felt that like emotional reaction to it. I was like, oh wow, it's like Kyle's a normal person. He's giving this presentation. He did humanize you quite a bit, and I think people in the audience and people watching webinars, and it just helps people like connect to them. Oh wow, they're a real person. They have a family. Like we're in this, and we're kind of all in this together right now in a very similar way. So
yeah, I've been trying to teach him how to say DevOps, because the next time he comes in, I want to be like DevOps, fist pump, and then get involved a bit.
That's great. That's great. Work on that.
Yeah.
You'll have to teach Mabel to do that, Mason.
I think I've got some ideas there. I'm going to work on that.
Well, like you said, you do have you've had quite a few years of startup story. It would be interesting to kind of hear, how did you originally, one, move out to San Francisco, get into startups, and then continue on this path until growing a startup for a number of years, maybe close to a decade, and then eventually ending up at a larger corporation.
Yeah, that's it's fun to kind of walk through those journeys a bit. And so when I moved out to, as you mentioned, I grew up in South Dakota. So, I actually started working for startups back then. And yes, there are startups in South Dakota. And when I was ready, I hadn't really seen much of the country. I hadn't really spent much time outside of South Dakota, so I was ready to leave. And I didn't really have my sights set on the Bay Area. I was kind of willing to go anywhere a great job took me. But I'm very happy and fortunate that the Bay Area was where I first got hired, came out and landed with a great company called Better World Books. Absolutely fascinating business model, social impact company, triple bottom line, very cool business model. So check that out. And at the same time, it was also serendipitous that the music scene is phenomenal in the Bay Area. So many great concerts and so much great culture, arts, music, food, all of those things here. So really, found myself more and more in San Francisco. And as I took different jobs and grew and became a stronger developer, more and more I was getting involved in the product experience and helping to define what we're doing and who's the customer and how do we solve for these things, and how do we figure out SEO or what's our growth channels and things like that. And so I was really fascinated by the Silicon Valley culture, and it's palpable here, right? You show up in Silicon Valley and you show up in the Bay Area, it's everywhere. Like I would go to Starbucks and Biz Stone and the Twitter founders would be standing in line in front of me, and it really rubbed off on me. So I kind of got the bug to start a company, and thought for a long time about what that would be. But I decided to just take the leap. I quit my job and I started freelancing with the goal of thinking that while freelancing and kind of doing contract work, I would figure it out and I would come up with an idea, or I would meet somebody and who had a great idea. And so that's kind of when, Matt and I met and started talking about the legal space. Not something that I had ever imagined I would be working on, but clearly anybody who's ever had to deal with a lawyer can, I think, empathize with just the challenge, the scary feeling of having to hire them, not knowing anything about the law, it being really opaque and complicated and hard to understand. And we really kind of got pretty jazzed about, trying to democratize the law and make it easier to, reduce that feeling of it being scary and easier to find and hire lawyers. So
yeah, and everyone always has the question of like, how do you meet your co-founder? You guys met at a meetup, right?
It was actually mutual friends. So his, he was working in a law firm and he had a bunch of legal lawyer attorney friends, and they were consulting with and working with some of my entrepreneurial friends too. So we kind of got mutually introduced. And I remember the first time we met and started chatting. We drank many beers and threw out lots of ideas, and it was, first shot, we kind of knew that like this was something that we wanted to figure out and work together on. So, yeah, it turned out to be, when you start a company, you're really not sure how long it's going to last, right? There's so many stories about how hard it is to succeed as a startup, and the success rates are abysmal, and you just don't know. And we're just really thrilled that we made it as long as we did, and we got the outcome that we did.
While you were working in the business, I mean, can you elaborate a little bit more on your role, the team, sort of how big did the team grow, and sort of what were some of the technologies that you guys were working with? Because I think it's always good to set a good premise for sort of like the DevOps side of the conversation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I have some really good stories about the tech stack for sure, because originally early on, and I've gotten a lot of crap for this, but I was a .NET developer, right? So I worked in ASP.NET and the Microsoft .NET framework for many years before we started the company. And when we started writing code, I wanted to try something new and I wanted to build on a new framework, but I knew that if I did that, everything was just going to be slower, harder, and if we wanted to move quick, and I had no money, I had no salary, we weren't getting paid, so I needed to get this thing out the door as soon as possible, which meant I needed to use the frameworks that I was familiar with. So built everything originally in ASP.NET. And to be honest, back in the day, this is 2011, 2012, DevOps wasn't really a term back then. And, deploying your code, especially on a Windows server, was not the most graceful thing. You had some, great tools and frameworks that were coming out, but a lot of folks that I know in the space were dragging their files over FTP and uploading them into the server, and then you log into the server and you drag them onto the active folder, and then you go restart IIS. Yeah. That's how I would deploy code for many, many years. And so I really feel like I missed out on the DevOps movement, because I think that it's just such a cool, application of technology, and thinking about infrastructure as code and all of that. I was long past kind of coding once those things became far more popular and ubiquitous. But so we started with ASP.NET, and we raised some initial funding, and we went out to try and hire some developers. And let me tell you, hiring .NET developers in the Bay Area into a startup is very challenging. It's like oil and water; they just don't fit very well. And we figured out that we had to face the facts that we couldn't hire, and we couldn't hire fast enough. So we had to actually rebuild the entire stack. And I pushed back and I hesitated, and I was really not interested in doing that. But we were burning money while we're trying to hire, and we're not moving fast enough. So it was a huge opportunity cost. So So we did it. We took on the one thing that everybody will tell you never to do, which is like, rebuild your entire stack from the ground up.
I will always tell you to do this. So this is a good stopping point, because everything I hear that you're going through, I think you are in such an amazing place to have experienced that, right? And I would value that and hold on to it, because as somebody who had a very practical journey to get to where I'm at, it's those things, those super painful things, that have shaped my view of how I think about DevOps. And I often advocate for lean DevOps. That webinar I just did, it was called Building a Culture of Delivery Using Lean DevOps. And I really believe that the technology you choose, if you start with technology, it has a hard time or will set up different philosophies and best practices. And if DevOps is philosophy, best practices, and tools, you have to read the book front to back, not back to front. So what are the philosophies, best practices, the needs? Hiring. We want to be able to hire fast. How do the tools reflect that? You're just in such a fortunate spot to have experienced that, right? And I think it's worth stating that and being appreciative of it, because I think so many people don't get to go through that opportunity to look at those challenges and then have the courage to make the decision you did. Always give yourself permission to throw things away. I mean, be careful. It can be a time investment, but it's a hard decision, right?
It is a tough one. It's a tough one. It's probably one of the biggest decisions I've ever made when it comes to software development, honestly, and the risks that were there, right? There was a risk in either path. There was a fork in the road. We either kept our technology, and there was a risk in not hiring, or we rebuilt it, and there was a risk that it would take forever and it would not work well, or we would have a bunch of issues, or we still wouldn't be able to hire. I mean, there were so many unknowns. But we did it. We made a plan. That was the very precise moment when I stopped writing code.
Okay.
Because I started really focusing on the migration plan and how are we going to pull this off, so that as a startup, you can't just stop shipping features. We needed to continue adding value for the customer, and we needed to figure out how to do that while rewriting and rebuilding something in parallel.
What did that migration plan look like? Because this is one of those things that I think always comes up for every team, and it's super unintuitive. I feel like there's some patterns that you can use, things like the strangler pattern, and there's some ideas out there that help with this, but the number one thing that helps you rationalize this, if you're feeling, that burden and you kind of got to admit to yourself, well, we might need to make some changes here, is hearing from other people about how they thought through it and what was their plan to make it make sense and balance that dichotomy.
Yeah. Actually, I think it, to give a spoiler here, it turned out really well, and we did it in a very short amount of time. And the approach that we took was that we basically, it wasn't stop everything, rebuild it, and then have some big seminal launch event. Mm-hmm. We kept the .NET site running and up and alive, and in parallel, we spun up, Linux boxes to host. We chose Ruby on Rails. At the time, it was the hot new game in town.
Still solid.
And it's great. It's great. And we said, okay, we're going to build the foundation. We need to invest upfront in sort of putting in the right, foundation here and building out some microservices. And anytime we needed to change something on an existing page, we would never change the .NET site. We would take that opportunity, pad it, and rebuild it in Rails. And page by page, feature by feature, we would move things over. But before we could stand up these two very different environments, we needed to extract out a bunch of really, foundational things as well, like authentication, sessions, database access needed to be shared amongst these two very different platforms, so that when you logged in on .NET and you landed on a Rails page, you didn't have to log in again, right? You needed to make sure that it was a seamless experience. So we basically serendipitously built a service-oriented architecture by necessity, because we extracted out these things. We made these really small little services, which a lot of them we built in Node.js actually. And so those things one by one became shared, and then page by page we could migrate things over. And within 4 months or less, we had everything completely migrated, and we had no remaining .NET code running at all. And so, it's one of my proudest achievements as a technology leader, and something that I've actually given a number of talks on, to have to go through that. And I do agree with you, because if you're going to rebuild it, do it earlier rather than later, right? Because the more and more you build and the more features you ship, the deeper you've now dug that hole for yourself later. So I think that was an advantage, that we did it sooner, and didn't just push it down years down the line.
Oh man, I'm pumped, because we'll send you the Lean DevOps talk I had done after this, because it kind of, what I try to do is break these problems, these ideas down into a talk where people can start thinking about it early and understand that journey. And one of the things that I've always said is, like, it helps to start with a bit of a physics mindset, like what Elon will say about, problems. It's like, start assuming you're wrong, or it's going to be wrong, and don't overcommit. Give yourself permission to throw it away and retest your assumptions, because you can only really build for right now, because you don't know what it's going to look like later. We have even a similar set of challenges within our business, because as a DevOps company, we invest heavily into DevOps, so adopting tools like Kubernetes and these sorts of things, which are great. In the long term, this is like super valuable. But then at the same time, it's like, it comes with a level of overhead and a level of matureness that, okay, well, what if we just want to iterate? So one of the things that we do, and I've seen others do, is actually run two systems in parallel, where one is like a place that has certain limitations built into it, like it's Lambda, it's serverless, you can only build 250 megabytes worth of code before you hit those limitations. And then there's a ton of creativity that comes from that constraint, but it forces you at some point to go like, look, this is getting too big, and at what point do we retest our assumptions? And at that point, if it's mature enough, you build it into the more mature framework. But what I'm really excited to understand about that, and what I'd assume is part of the proudest achievement, is you approach the technology in such a way where it had this non-technical related business outcome. So tell me about the hiring. How did the hiring go once you went through all of this, right? Like, totally non-technical problem, right?
Yeah, we were able to hire and bring on really strong developers. And we were able to tell a really interesting story even while we were amidst the migration, right? I wasn't a Rails developer. That was another reason to kind of stop writing code at that time. But we needed to bring someone in who could make sure that we didn't make all of the mistakes early on of, like, the both the benefit and the challenge with Rails is that there's just so much magic, and there's so much that it does for you, that you've got to understand a little bit of what's happening under the hood, so that you don't just take the things out of the box when, like, maybe that's just a super inefficient way to do things, right? Or maybe you need to rethink some of these components and make them a little bit more adaptable to your needs. So we hired super strong developers amidst that migration. They were really excited about a greenfield project, right? Like, oh, you mean I get to, like, start from scratch and, like, give me the opportunity to architect something foundational and influence the future of that. I mean, that's a great sell, right?
Yeah.
And we brought folks in and they were able to help make that more successful, and then we were able to build the team and hire from there. So definitely we solved the business problem of not being able to hire. And even though today I will still tell you that I think ASP.NET is a great framework, and there's nothing wrong with .NET, it's just a culture thing about being in Silicon Valley and how that played out.
It's rarely about the technology. It's usually about, like, philosophies, best practices, and then tools. I think tools just immortalize whatever your philosophies and best practices. And definitely in the Bay Area, there's this sort of agile mindset about where, like, Ruby on Rails is great. I know Node has been really popular because you can kind of pull things in, and it's a little bit more a la carte in how you choose it. We use it a lot. That's great. I mean, did you ever sunset the .NET stuff? Was there ever a day where you poured one out for the .NET stack and said, "Hey, see you later"? And okay,
we did.
How was that?
We did. Yeah, it was good scotch.
Yeah,
it was good scotch.
Cool.
Yeah, we definitely celebrated, because I think we were all, like, interested in just trying to make sure that we had the right outcome and that we didn't hit a bunch of snags along the way. And certainly, you run into issues and you adapt and solve them, but we were able to pull it off. And what I think is, record time, like very good amount of time. we didn't have to disrupt the business too much, and we did ship new features amidst that, right?
Yeah.
So it was it's still something I think fondly upon, for sure.
It's one of those things that I think when you go through that and people get reinvigorated and there's a bit of a reassessment, it's initially hard to get over it, but then it creates this cohesive momentum and a commitment to the team amongst everybody above all else that really can be foundational for the long term of your engineering culture.
Yeah, I agree. I think, like, as I'm telling the story and thinking about that, I haven't thought about that era for a while now, but we were just so tight, and we worked in a very small space. We're basically in an apartment and like very close quarters and just working tirelessly, super long hours. I mean, it's like that quintessential startup story that you hear, like, dudes drinking beer and Mountain Dew and pizza and like, just having a good time and enjoying the work.
That's why I can't watch Silicon Valley. It's too real. It's not funny for me.
Yeah, be careful. It is. Yeah, I agree.
Oh, yeah.
I agree. It's very on the nose.
Yeah. That's why I've never been able to watch it. I think I watched one episode, and when I was in San Francisco still, and I was like, oh, I think I can actually. It's too good.
Yeah,
it's too good.
Especially the first few seasons are very spot on, for sure. Yep.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've talked a lot about, and along this journey, is some of the traits that a leader has, a startup leader. Especially coming from the technical side, and we've talked a lot about the EQ, the emotional intelligence side of it. Do you want to go into that a little bit and how you think that learning that or being a master at that sort of skill has really helped you in your journey in development and in startups?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something I'm really passionate about, and I think first off, I'm an empath, right? So I very much am an emotional person, and I think a lot about others and what they're going through, and I think it led me to kind of finding ways to integrate that into my leadership and my management style. So early on, you go from being a developer to an entrepreneur to a manager, and like there's no real formal training that you have, not usually anyway. And so you're kind of like figuring it out as you go along. And the thing that I like to talk about with developers who are wondering whether they want to go into management or not, right? Most answers are I don't know, because I've never tried it before. I don't know if I would be good at it. I don't know if I would like it. I don't know if I would miss coding, all of these things. And it's inherently a very different set of problems, right? Like as developers, we come to the world and we expect ones and zeros, and we want behavior, and we expect the code to do what we've told it to do. But people are irrational beings, and it's hard to have predictability. It's hard to kind of go from that developer mindset into the manager mindset. So I think it was out of necessity for me to think about ways to introduce the tools and the mental models for myself to approach those things. And that's when I kind of discovered emotional intelligence and did a bunch of reading on that. And so there's a handful of really great books out there. One particular author is Daniel Goleman, who's I think he's the father of this concept generally. He coined the term emotional intelligence. And so it arrived as a new concept, but then it's now been adapted more and more. And there's specific books about how to bring that into the management style and how to approach that from a business context. So I became fascinated by this, and I think I realized more and more that this is one of the things that I feel is missing from like the technology sector a lot. Like especially developers think that the stereotype is that developers can just show up and write their code, and I don't want to deal with people. Leave me alone, put me in the corner, and I'll write code. But I don't think that's the way that most developers want to behave or act anymore. I think that's a completely inaccurate stereotype, and they are a lot of times probably lacking the tools to approach their manager or understand how to get comfortable with having difficult conversations or interact with their colleagues when maybe they're having a difficult conversation or they disagree about something. And so these tools and these frameworks are important for that. So, I think it starts with self-awareness, right? Before you start trying to observe and understand others, you've really got to understand yourself. And I think that's a very important core tenet of emotional intelligence, and like recognizing what you're feeling, or catching yourself when you're getting upset, like somebody said something to you, or like you're having a disagreement, and instead of reacting and saying something and it kind of spinning out of control, you've got to be able to catch yourself and like be aware of your own emotions, your own sort of feelings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I often hear that it's totally normal to feel this whole suite of human emotions. It's really comes in the reaction, when in how you handle that reaction, in how there can be a lot of tweaking and iteration.
Yeah. First you have to be aware of it, and then you can start to figure out how to manage it, right? So that's the kind of the second core tenet is self-management. So self-awareness, that you're able to recognize what it is that's happening and your interactions with others, or your response to what's going on in the world right now. I think one of the reasons we talked about this being a good topic is, there's a lot to process right now. And the workplace has changed a lot as well.
And that was going to be one of my follow-up questions, is like, how do you think about this now, moving from, into this remote centric world, right?
Even more important than ever, right? I mean, even though we're having Zoom conversations and it's not a physically intimate like relationship with your coworkers, it is I'm finding deeper value and deeper relationships that are happening because we're having these really uncomfortable conversations about what's going on right now. And we're getting closer to our colleagues by understanding their home situation, right? Like if you're at home and you're having to watch your kid, you don't want to come and show up and have the same expectations of your team if they really like are stuck and like they've got to split their time. And so that's empathy, right? That's like recognizing what somebody's going through, caring about them enough to say, let's adjust your schedule, or let's talk about the timeline, and let's make sure that you're not burning yourself out or feeling as though you need to work nights and weekends to make this happen. And depending on the company culture, maybe that is the expectation, but I would just urge people to be thinking about what's in the best interest of the happiness of your team, because when workers are happy, they're more productive and they enjoy their work, and they have longevity, and there's less churn, all of these things, right? Like it starts with happiness. And so figuring out how to address those things with your team is such a core thing. So that's kind of where I started, and I think I like kind of being the I've come to some technical conferences, and I'm like the one guy not talking about technical topics, bringing like emotional intelligence, and I think it's fine. It's great. I want to be that guy. I want to be somebody kind of helping to bring awareness to the things. It's not just about the code, right? The code would be nothing if it weren't about the people and the interactions that we're having while we're writing the code, or the interactions that it's facilitating when the product is live in production as well. So
yeah, I mean that's I love it, because I mean I've been trying to bring that conversation a bit. That's why I did the CNCF webinar this morning. It's like, look, technology is great, but if you don't start with the philosophies, the best practices, or like to your point, the people and how do they work, like how do you really even get into the tools and like reinforce those things that work between people in tools? If you read the book backwards, you're not going to get to the same conclusion. One of the things for me personally, as I reflect on this, like I know and have always known, my self-awareness is that I know, based at least on the like insights assessment, which is one of the personality frameworks that you can use, I'm like a very red personality. So I'm very objective driven. I'm all about the goal. And, while I really care about people and I'm very focused on trying to help everybody have success, when I'm prioritizing information, I'm always prioritizing very outcome driven information. Like, how do I get to that, right? And so one of the things that I've done to sort of rationalize into my framework and balance it out is I know I really like, I know we all talk about radical candor, but I think the foundation of radical candor is the idea that if you have this strong empathy driven and like your relationship is tight, you can then challenge people more directly, right? Like, and so if you can balance that out and go, look, if I don't invest into the empathy, if I don't invest into a strong relationship, strong EQ, and acknowledging people in that way and building that strong foundation, then I won't be able to challenge my engineering team more directly. And when they are more challenged, they will have a harder time overcoming that challenge because there isn't this foundation to fall back on of like knowing that I care personally so I can challenge directly. And I think when you kind of put it in that context for some leaders who have a tendency to be more outcome driven, more challenging in how they think about prioritizing their the information that they hear or the way that they approach it, it really does a good job to balance out how you think about like a holistic. And I know my tendency is to be more about the goal, about moving the needle and achieving the outcome. And so I really try to say like, look, what do I need? What's the work I have to do up front to get to a place where I can actually be that version of myself? Because I realize that it is not necessarily the same way that everyone else works as well. And I think it's some of those training that I've done in the past with Insights, for example, was the thing that really opened my eyes up to it. As a software engineer and a CTO at the time, I was always thinking about things as just like code and like achieve the thing. But then once I just realized, hey, look, there's all kinds of like syntax that can be understood at the people level, and you got to start there. It really like flipped my whole situation around.
Yeah, I love that. I think actually a lot of what you're talking about is I think part of this concept of psychological safety.
Yep.
And you can't. It's very hard to have radical candor if, as you said, you don't have the strong relationship to start with.
Yep.
And because otherwise, the radical candor is going to lead to like someone being offended that you were so direct, right? And you went straight to the point. But if you can build that foundation and you can create a space where people feel comfortable to speak up, then you can be objective driven and you can be all about the outcome. But people will feel comfortable to raise their hand and say, I don't think that it's feasible, or I disagree with some of our decisions, right? And this is where I think the diversity of teams and the inclusiveness of how teams are built and how hiring works is like the benefit can only be seen if you build a psychologically safe environment, right? Because you want to hear from the diverse ideas and their backgrounds and their opinions, right? Yeah. It's great when 5 people in the room have 5 different ideas. That's awesome, because now when we've reached an outcome, we're going to feel better because we've evaluated more options and we've left fewer stones unturned, And so I think a lot about that as well, like the psychological safety. It reminds me of there's a project, a research project that Google did, and it's been widely discussed. So maybe you've both heard about it. It's a Project Aristotle. Yeah. And it was Google's multi-year effort to figure out what is it that makes a team successful, and to the study of work itself, and figure out like, they looked at everything. Like, is it when we put all the PhDs in one team, are they more successful? Or is it when we pull up other, look at other ways to evaluate this? So, but what they found is actually that psychological safety and the culture of that team and the norms of that team, when they were more safe to speak up and make their opinions heard, that was the most important factor in them being successful. Yeah. So it's and that I think that was really eye-opening for me, right? Like you can have great PhDs and maybe you need those on your team given the product that you're building, but I think focusing more on the emotional aspect and what people are feeling, like it has direct outcomes on the productivity, the success, the ship rate, the production issues, everything across the board.
Yeah, one of the things that I found is maybe like just following that thread through. I think that's very foundational, but I think the challenge that sometimes I've seen groups run into, I just simply describe as the bike shed, Parkinson's law of triviality, where an engineer typically they're already sometimes resistant to meetings because meetings sometimes can feel inefficient. The more voices in the room, you start having design by committee. There's sort of this, this tension that starts to rise of how does my voice get involved in this, or maybe I think differently and opinions start to roll in. And I think like coming up with a framework for how that works is just generally really important, because it can get to a place where when every voice is heard, you fundamentally get to a place where there's no clear decision or direction that can be made, or you just inflate the amount of ideas in the room. And I think the thing that I've thought a lot about is how to empower that bottom-up voice, make it something that people can offer, that they feel clear, but then you need to have a clear process for triaging and working through the conclusions kind of top down, because I think ultimately that's becomes the role then of leadership and stakeholders. And the simplest way that I've learned to do this is to acknowledge I've heard you. I understand what you're saying, and I'm processing that through all of the other information I'm getting from other places. And as a result, you've now influenced me to say that this is what I think we should do. And I'm saying that not in a form of wanting to cast a vote and us sort of go into that process, but I'm saying like, look, your voice has influenced the democratic process of coming to a conclusion. But as your leader, like I'm going to help you make this decision now. And do you agree with it? And then you get into this place of general consensus without running into the sort of what I would call like the high overhead of truly holocratic decision making, which can be very challenging. And I think, Spotify's culture actually recently took some interesting feedback on this, because I think the intention was very pure from the beginning, very bottom up, very inclusive. Anybody can do anything. Kind of autonomy is important. And generally, we were working through similar organizational conversations at a similar time, and really believed in bottom up. But with that, I think that feedback that was in the open, and I think it was on Hacker News or something, somebody wrote a blog post about it, was highlighted as like, you need to have both of it. And I come back to radical candor and kind of the frame of how I think about this. Is like you set that foundation for really an open, safe space, but then you find that ability to challenge the opinions directly to find the best one. And then when that best one, if it emerges through consensus, awesome. Now everybody's in agreement. That's the best situation, because it means we're all aligned. But if it doesn't, then there's still a burden on leadership to make a decision based on the information. And so I think it's sort of like good that there's a stated format in which somebody at that meeting, maybe it's the person who called it or whatever, whoever's facilitating that, they also have the burden of, if there is no conclusion, this person has to facilitate the sort of disagree and commit model that we hear coming out of the Amazon culture, because the group has to be able to prioritize moving forward with the best idea that is comes from that unison of voices, right?
Yep, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think, just to be clear, I don't think that like every decision should be made in a democratic perspective like that. I think that's too far. You've got to find a balance, right? Everything needs to happen in moderation. And I agree. I think we had gone through a lot of the same things, right? It can't just be a purely tops down culture where the leadership just decides everything and they're not hearing the voice of their team. And it can't be entirely bottoms up either, because how are you going to get anything done if everybody has to be, there'll be just too many cooks in the kitchen. So there's a really, delicate and challenging balance. And I think it's probably different for every company to find that graceful way to make a decision, move on, and whether it's the leader coming in, making a call, or whether it's empowering someone to disagree and commit. I was kind of waiting to say that, and you beat me to the punch.
Sorry about that.
No, it's great. It's great, because for sure you've got to have something like that. We're not going to come to an agreement, right? I remember having a conversation with my team at one point, and we were talking about whether we were going to introduce Vue or React or what new JavaScript framework, and people are very opinionated about these things.
Yeah. And
there's not really a right or wrong answer, right? Like you just gotta pick one and go for it. And it's hard to get everybody on the same page on a decision like that, right? So, but yeah, I agree. So you've got to help them along the way to prevent the deadlock on those decisions.
One thing I picked up from one of Reid Hoffman's Masters of Scale podcasts was a strategy for how to set some expectations up front about like, where does autonomy turn into something where you got to like check in with me, or like I need to be involved in that decision, right? And like the way he phrased it was, and I tried this with different people on my leadership team, different senior people on the team, because I do think it's a bit hard to to rationalize maybe for a more junior team member. But the way he articulated it was, if the action you're going to take results in more than a 20% potential margin of error, right? Like, so if you're going to come within 20% of your goal, I'm okay with whatever you decide as long as you're prioritizing an outcome of speed and velocity, because that is the highest thing. So if you can do it faster and there's going to be some I have a tolerance of error. If it's going to be a higher tolerance of error or slower, then I want you to check in with me. And basically what he's communicating is like, at that point, we can work through trying to maybe simplify the scope or rationalize the pathway forward. And what it did do is, I think, especially in like a very high growth environment, set a frame for what is an acceptable sort of failure tolerance, and like create that safe space for you to experiment and iterate by prioritizing speed. But then at some point, like, here's how we overcome that threshold and where we should check in, because the ROI calculation of the opportunity cost isn't necessarily adding up to. And so I think there's like an important set of frameworks that we need to start establishing as technology teams that better communicate what that looks like. ICE is one of the ones that I promote, like impact plus confidence divided by effort. Gives me a sense of whether you're prioritizing your best work or not. Like, and I think figuring out what those sort of mental frameworks are that communicate and include having a safe space while also factoring in the other outcome driven variables, I think like creates a really good way for people to think about how they allocate their time, energy, and opinions. And you know, opinions is one of the ones where it definitely, like you said, it can get crazy. So one of the things I always do there is I'm like, great, I understand that you care more about React than Vue. For me, it's pretty much the same thing, doesn't matter that much. So can you actually explain to me in some form of data, because if it's an opinion, let's use mine, but if it's data, let's trust the data, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree, and I think it's really nice to have experienced founders, right? Somebody who's been through these things before. Because I think about my experience, right? Like again, you're just sort of building the parachute on the way down after you've jumped off the cliff. But once you've gone through it, and you've earned some battle scars, you know, you can come at it, and you know, I would be excited to start a company again, because I feel like I would be armed with so much more knowledge and experience, having been in that seat now before, and to be able to develop, you know, a toolbox of frameworks like this, right? And know that it's not a one size fits all, but that you've got a number of options and you can kind of use them when the situation arises. And I think it sounds like that's where you've landed, you know, having done this before with a lot of great tools and ways to approach these problems systematically, which, you know, it's great.
I feel like I have a lot of ideas now, but what I've been learning the second time around is how to try to communicate those ideas in a way that people who haven't had the same experience as me can understand them better. And I have a very different set of experiences, whether it's being a high school dropout or like these sorts of things, where I just found my way into tech through a very like I kind of grinded it out to get these battle scars along the way, right? So I learned those pains early. But what's been hard the second time around is like figuring out, again, how to state the philosophies and best practices and then reinforce that that's first, and like then tools should reinforce that, or, you know, whether it's process or it's framework or it's, you know, technology, whatever. And I think that's something that like I definitely struggled to figure out, in how to communicate these things that felt very intuitive and clear to me. Like I maybe should have took more time to recognize that people didn't have the same experiences that I have had, and I need to put more time into communicating what these things mean, because as you guys know, like startups are unintuitive, you know, and it's only by going through that process that you really understand it, like we said. So I definitely have a passion for trying to figure out how do we communicate these things, because I know the job is to repeat yourself a lot. Like that's just what you got to keep saying it over and over and over again. Like that's the job, right? But I do think that the more we can get these ideas normalized into our teams or normalized into the mainstream, the more that there's like some convergence of how we think about these things, while still representing that everybody works differently, and that's cool. I think the better we can all do to help others who come after us, like get through this, you know, their struggle, be successful. And I think that's kind of like the obligation, right? Is like, that's the pay it forward model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. Well, with that, I think we're just about at a wrap. Mason, any last words?
Plugs.
No, I think this is great.
Thoughts?
I'm very thankful to have the opportunity to speak with you guys and tell your community a little bit more about kind of my thoughts around emotional intelligence and my story. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
Where can we find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn. Search for Mason Blake.
What's the LinkedIn profile? Mason Blake.
Mason Blake. Yep, exactly.
Got
yep,
it.
and
right.
I think we can watch out for the product that we've been working on, which I didn't talk much about, but we're building a service marketplace, much like Up Council. So anybody who's offering a service, and eventually we will have DevOps on there, but software development of any kind, you can list yourself as a provider and get leads and engage with folks who are looking to hire people just like yourself.
Great timing for something like that. We know we hear a lot from people in our community. They're very interested in where are these opportunities. That plus the LinkedIn learning stuff that you guys have at LinkedIn, like our teams use that. I think that's great because, big need right now is to help retrain and, add new experiences
Upskill.
and upskill people and then help them find that. And, just like some of the changes that we went through in 2008, that where the gig economy came up, and say what you will, I don't know, we got everything right there. I think there's a huge opportunity on the other side of COVID to reassess how people are going to upskill and find new opportunities and get that clear foundation. So you're doing great work, Mason. I'm looking forward to it, man.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much.
All right.
Yeah, looking forward to seeing how that develops. And with that, Kyle, take us out. That's it for the Op Show today.
Yeah.